Beneath the smog-choked skies of Terra, where the ash of a billion industries falls like grey snow upon the endless hive, there stands a fortress so vast that it dwarfs mountains and swallows horizons. The Imperial Palace, more city than citadel, more myth than stone, is a labyrinth of golden halls and blackened spires. At its core lies the most sacred chamber in the galaxy, the sanctum of the Golden Throne. Here, in a chamber older than the Imperium itself, sits the Emperor of Mankind, neither alive nor dead, enthroned for 10 millennia upon a machine built to hold back the night. The throne hums with a low, ceaseless vibration, its power drawn from rivers of sacrificed psyches, each life burned out to fuel a beacon that pierces the immaterium. That beacon is the Astronomican, the light by which humanity's fleets navigate the warp, and without it, the galaxy would fall into darkness. But the throne is failing. No artisan alive understands its mechanisms, no mechanicus magos dares claim mastery over its secrets. For centuries, whispers have spread among the tech priests who descend into its caverns of machinery. They say that the machine groans where once it sang, that cracks web its sacred circuits, that systems thought eternal now stutter in irregular rhythms. Some claim to have seen its lights flicker, its pulse grow faint, though such words are quickly silenced. Even the Adeptus Custodes, those golden giants who stand eternal vigil around their master, cannot deny the truth they see with their own eyes. They are not prone to fear, but unease gnaws at them nonetheless, for they feel the subtle slowing of the throne's beat, as if a titan's heart were faltering. Every day, thousands are fed to the throne. Psykers plucked from across the Imperium are marched in chains through Terra's endless corridors of shrines, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies trembling with the weight of what awaits them. Some scream prayers, others curse their fate, but all are dragged before the doors of the sanctum and delivered to the sacrifice. Their essence is consumed to stoke the dying light. Billions have already burned for this cause, their souls shredded and cast into the warp to keep one ember alive. Humanity survives not through triumph, but through this endless immolation, each life a candle guttering in a storm. The Mechanicus call it maintenance. The Ecclesiarchy calls it worship. The Custodes call it necessity. But beneath the words, the truth is the same. The Golden Throne is not eternal, and the Emperor cannot sit upon it forever. In the shadows of Terra's cathedrals, priests whisper different prayers than those they speak aloud. Some pray not for the Emperor's survival, but for his mercy when the light finally dies. For though the Imperium has lived 10,000 years under his silent rule, the memory of his voice has faded. The last words he spoke were during the siege of Terra, when Horus fell and the palace ran with the blood of gods. Since then, there has been only silence. Silent but not absent, for his presence still radiates in every spark of the Astronomican. And yet, that presence is dimming. Imagine the silence within the sanctum, broken only by the hum of ancient machinery and the rasp of custodian armor. Imagine the smell of oil and incense, the thick smoke of 1,000 censers clinging to gilded walls, the flicker of lumen torches casting long shadows across the throne's colossal form. There is awe here, but also dread. For the closer one stands to the Emperor, the more undeniable the truth becomes. His body is rotting. Wires pierce his flesh, tubes feed and drain him, mechanical arms cradle a corpse that should long since have turned to dust. The Custodes say he endures. The Mechanicus say he persists. The Ecclesiarchy says he lives eternal. But to any mortal eye, he is a relic, a broken king upon a broken throne. The question gnaws, unspoken but felt in every heart. How long can this last? Even Terra feels it. Outside the palace, in the endless sprawl of hive cities, people whisper of omens. Astropaths report sudden silences in their choirs, fleeting shadows moving across their shared visions. Navigators speak of turbulence, the Astronomican's once steady flame flickering like a candle in wind. Ordinary citizens, those who know nothing of psychers or warp light, wake in the night with dread they cannot name, as if the heartbeat of their god has skipped a beat. Fear spreads like rot, though it cannot be spoken openly. For to doubt the Emperor is heresy, and heresy is death. Yet the silence grows longer between the pulses, and everyone can feel it. The Golden Throne is more than a machine. It is a prison, a tomb, a lighthouse, and perhaps even a weapon. But what if it were never meant to hold him so long? What if its failing is not merely age, but destiny? The Mechanicus will not answer, for they know nothing. The Ecclesiarchy will not answer, for faith admits no weakness. The Custodes will not answer, for they are sworn only to guard, never to question. So the question echoes unanswered through the halls of Terra. What happens when the Golden Throne grows silent? The first custodian who dared to feel doubt felt it as he stood within the sanctum, his guardian spear resting against the marble floor, his eyes locked upon the Emperor's unmoving face. He knew that he would never voice it, never speak the fear aloud, but it settled in his heart like ice. If the throne fails, everything fails. If the light goes out, the galaxy is lost. And so, though he said nothing, he tightened his grip upon the spear and swore that he would not let his master's light falter without bathing the throne's chamber in the blood of those who came for it. For that is what remains when hope fades, the promise of defiance, even in silence. The throne grows weaker, and in the quiet between its faltering pulses, the galaxy holds its breath. The approach to the Golden Throne is unlike any other journey in the galaxy. It begins in the endless streets of Terra, where pilgrims shuffle in their millions, pressing shoulder to shoulder through avenues that have not seen sunlight in centuries. Each step brings them closer to sanctity, and each step narrows the path. Those who begin this pilgrimage as free souls are often psykers, chained in silence, their minds already trembling at the edges of the warp. To be chosen for the throne is both curse and elevation, and the paradox is clear in their eyes. Some believe they are martyrs whose essence will sustain the Emperor's flame. Others know they are little more than fuel to a machine that devours them whole. The further one climbs, the heavier the air becomes. Promethium torches burn ceaselessly in the shrine corridors, filling the lungs with acrid smoke. Servitors, their humanity stripped to nothing but stuttering chants and clattering augmetics, carry censers of incense that leave the senses drowning in cloying perfume. Priests line the walls, their vox grills amplifying prayers that echo through the stone like thunder, calling upon the Emperor to accept each offering of life. It is not ceremony. It is ritual necessity, and without it, the Imperium would die. At the final threshold stand the custodes. They do not move, but they are everywhere, each one a golden sentinel towering over mortal men. To pass their gaze is to feel weighed, measured, and found wanting. The psykers collapse in terror at their approach, their minds fraying under the aura of warriors crafted to stand at the Emperor's side. Few understand that the custodes do not hate them, nor pity them. They see only duty. Each soul must burn so that humanity may see another dawn. Yet beneath their unblinking masks, the custodians know the truth better than any priest. They have watched the throne weaken. They have felt the Astronomican stutter ripple across their own perception. They know that each sacrifice buys only another moment, another heartbeat, another day in which the galaxy does not collapse. Inside, the chamber of the throne is cavernous, more vast than a cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadow. At the center, upon a dais of obsidian and gold, the Emperor's form sits motionless, cradled in the arms of the throne's machine limbs. Around him, the mechanisms of forgotten design churn endlessly, pipes dripping with condensation, gears grinding with tired force, conduits hissing as they vent raw energy into the void. Tech priests shuffle about like insects beneath the feet of a god, their faces hidden behind copper masks, their voices reduced to binharic whispers. They make offerings of oil, chant the catechisms of activation, and perform rites as though ritual alone keeps the throne alive. Whether they preserve it or merely delay its inevitable collapse, none can say. To stand in this chamber is to feel a paradox. There is majesty here, for the Emperor's aura still radiates even in silence, pressing upon the mind with a weight that cannot be denied. Yet there is also decay. The flesh upon the throne is dry and brittle, the bones within armored wrappings hollow with age. The Emperor's lips do not move, yet every psyker in the galaxy hears his silent call. The Astronomican burns, but it burns like a star collapsing upon itself, unstable and desperate. And always, there is the smell. The incense hides it, but never erases it, the scent of old blood, machine oil, and the faint tang of decay. Those who serve here too long say the smell seeps into their skin, never to leave, as though the throne brands its servants with its own slow death. The sacrifices are brought forth. Chained psykers are lined before the sanctum, their voices raised in pleading cries. Some beg to be spared. Some demand to be used quickly. A rare few fall silent, their eyes fixed upon the Emperor with awe, believing in the promise that their end will sustain his eternal reign. None of them return. One by one, they are led within, offered to the machinery. Screams echo, cut short as their essence is torn from them, feeding into circuits that blaze with stolen power. The throne shudders, lights flaring briefly before sinking once more into their dying glow. Each life buys another flicker, another breath. And in the silence that follows, the custodians exchange brief, knowing glances. They have seen this for centuries, but now the intervals grow longer, the power weaker. It is as if the throne itself resents the sacrifices, its hunger infinite but its strength failing to keep pace with its consumption. There are whispers, though none dare speak them aloud. Some among the Mechanicus believe the throne was never designed to keep the Emperor alive, but to serve another purpose altogether. Perhaps it was a weapon, meant to open the webway and lead humanity to safety beyond the warp. Perhaps it was a coffin, built to entomb him after his final battle. But it is not fulfilling either purpose now. Instead, it is a beacon burning out, a machine choking on its own eternity, a god-king sustained by human ash. And though the galaxy cannot see it, the signs are everywhere. The Astronomican flickers in distant systems, leaving navigators blind for moments at a time. Astropaths collapse, their souls lacerated by sudden silences. Warp storms grow more violent at the edges of the light. The Imperium denies it, suppresses rumors, silences heretics. But truth has a way of bleeding through walls, and even the most faithful begin to whisper. The Golden Throne is dying. And with it, so too may die mankind. The Custodes stand closer to the Emperor than any being alive, and for 10,000 years they have been his unflinching guardians. They do not age as mortals do, nor falter in their duty, yet even their hearts are not immune to the creeping weight of silence. Each custodian knows the feel of the throne's pulse in his bones, the subtle psychic rhythm that echoes through the chamber like the heartbeat of the galaxy itself. When that rhythm stutters, they feel it more keenly than any navigator adrift in the warp. For centuries, they have told themselves it is an illusion, a trick of the mind, but now the pauses grow too long, the vibrations too faint. And though they will never speak it aloud, they fear. At times, in the stillness of the sanctum, one might imagine the Emperor's eyes flickering open. Custodians speak of such visions only in private meditations, never to each other, never to priests, for fear that the ecclesiarchy would brand it blasphemy. Yet it lingers in them like a ghostly memory, the sense of presence so immense it crushes thought, the flicker of light behind his dead gaze. Some believe it is real, a reminder that their master endures. Others believe it is nothing but a trick of despair, the mind conjuring hope where none exists. Beyond the throne, the galaxy trembles. Reports from the outer systems grow more dire by the year. Fleets stranded in the void, their navigators unable to find the Astronomican's light. Planets isolated for months at a time, then suddenly reconnected as if the beacon itself flares and dims at whim. On some worlds, faith cracks as swiftly as communication. What is the Emperor, if his light falters? What is the Imperium, if his silence deepens? The ecclesiarchy responds with fire, burning heretics and silencing doubts, but flame cannot smother truth. Faith can be forced, but doubt spreads faster, carried in whispers and dreams. For those chained psychers led to sacrifice, the throne's hunger is a promise and a curse. They feel the beacon in ways no UN-gifted human can. Some collapse before the sanctum doors, screaming visions of shadowed stars and seas of blood where once the Astronomican's light had shone. Others go quietly, broken by inevitability, their voices hollow as they murmur prayers that no longer sound like belief. The priests call this holy offering, but the psychers know it as execution. And yet, they also know the truth of it. Without their burning, the light would fade. They die to hold the line for a day longer, even as the line itself crumbles. In the depth of night, when Terra sleeps beneath its smog-choked skies, the palace is never silent. The throne groans like an ancient beast, its mechanisms grinding with effort, its power surging in uneven waves. The custodes patrol in silence, their golden armor gleaming dully in torchlight, their every step a ritual of vigilance. Tech priests murmur to machine spirits that no longer answer. And at the center of it all, the Emperor sits unmoving, his form brittle as bone, his presence immense as the stars. He has not spoken in 10,000 years. He has not moved in 10,000 years. And still, his people call him eternal. What is eternity, though, when measured against decay? There are moments when even the most faithful falter, when even the custodes, unshakable as mountains, feel the question pressing in their hearts. If the throne dies, if the light fails, what follows? Chaos unleashed? Humanity torn apart by isolation? Or something worse, something even they cannot imagine? None dare answer, for to do so would be to admit that the Emperor is not invincible. And so they watch, and wait, and guard a god who withers upon his throne. At the edges of the galaxy, unseen by Terra, shadows gather. Warp storms seethe, predators stir, and the light of the Astronomican flickers in their sight like prey's last breath. Even the warp seems to wait, patient and hungry, for the moment when the Golden Throne finally grows silent. The chapter closes not with certainty, but with silence. The silence of the throne's faltering pulse, the silence of a god-king who does not speak, and the silence of a galaxy balanced upon the edge of extinction. When the Astronomican shines, it is more than light, it is certainty. For navigators, it is the star by which every course is measured, the blazing signal that allows them to guide vast fleets across the boiling chaos of the warp. For astropaths, it is the anchor to which their minds cling, the steady rhythm that keeps their voices from being torn apart by the Imperium. For the Imperium as a whole, it is proof of the Emperor's presence, a holy reminder that though his voice is silent, his will still burns across the galaxy. When it falters, all of this falters with it. Imagine a void ship adrift in the warp. Its hull groans as unseen tides batter it, colors beyond mortal comprehension seething against its Geller field. The navigator sits in the sealed sanctum, third eye open, searching for the Astronomican. Yet where once it blazed like a sun across the immensity of the Imperium, now it flickers, a dim star struggling against darkness. The navigator trembles, sweat running down their pallid face, their lips whispering desperate prayers. Without the beacon, they cannot steer, cannot plot, cannot escape. The ship drifts blind, surrounded by predators that lurk unseen in the shifting madness of the warp. Across the Imperium, this scene repeats. Fleets are stranded, their missions aborted, their crews driven to despair. Some emerge from the warp centuries later, their hulls scarred and their crews hollow-eyed, entire generations born and lost within steel coffins. Others never emerge at all, their names vanishing from the registries of Segmentum Command, their destinies swallowed by madness. For every fleet that vanishes, dozens of worlds are left without supplies, reinforcements, or word from Terra. Isolation settles like a fog, and in isolation comes fear. On the surface of distant worlds, astropathic choirs strain their minds to send messages across the void. Once, they could reach Terra with clarity, their voices carried upon the burning certainty of the Emperor's will. Now their words twist and fragment, their cries lost in storms of psychic static. In some places, entire choirs collapse in unison, blood pouring from their eyes and mouths as their souls are shredded by silence. Survivors speak of darkness filling their vision, of hearing the faint laughter of diamonds in the emptiness where the Emperor's voice once anchored them. Even the strongest psychers cannot endure the void forever. For them, the Astronomican's faltering is not abstract, it is pain, knowing, endless. The Imperium's high lords refuse to admit the truth, at least not openly. Their proclamations speak of temporary disturbances, of storms in the warp that conceal the beacon but do not extinguish it. They assure the people that the Emperor's light endures. And in a sense, it does. But behind closed doors, panic festers. Reports pour in of colonies cut off, rebellions rising in the absence of imperial authority, Xeno's raiders striking at worlds unprotected by fleets that never arrived. The Imperium is too vast to govern even in the best of times, and in these moments of faltering light, it begins to tear at its seams. For the common citizen, the Astronomican is a myth. They do not see its glow, nor do they comprehend its function. Yet they feel its absence all the same. Supply shipments cease. Off-world governors vanish into silence. Rumors spread of ships that leave port and never return. Faithful priests whisper louder than before, their prayers more desperate, their sermons tinged with fear. To doubt the Emperor's presence is heresy, but when the crops rot and the skies darken with silence, doubt creeps in all the same. In the void, pirates thrive. Rogue traders turn predatory, seizing isolated planets under banners of false allegiance. Orcs bellow with joy at the sight of undefended systems, their fleets plunging through the warp with abandon, caring nothing for the light or its absence. To them, the faltering beacon is not doom, but invitation. Even the Eldari, long distrustful of the Emperor's light, feel the tremors of its weakness, their farseers muttering prophesies of cracks spreading across a galaxy already bleeding. For humanity, however, there is no prophecy, no vision, only the creeping realization that without the Astronomican, the Imperium becomes a prison of billions of isolated cells. The galaxy is vast, and without a guiding flame, each world is a lone candle in the storm. Some continue to burn brightly, sustained by faith and self-reliance. Others gutter and die within months, swallowed by hunger, rebellion, or the warp. And still, the throne consumes. Still, psychers burn. Still, the Emperor sits unmoving. The Astronomican flickers, never extinguished, but never steady. The Imperium survives, but each falter is a wound, and wounds left unchecked become death. On the fortress world of Marnoff's Gate, the first signs of the Astronomican's faltering came in silence. The great orbital docks, normally bustling with ships arriving and departing, became graveyards of steel. Vessels waited weeks, then months, for navigators to declare the warp safe. None did. Cargo rotted in the holds. Soldiers, ordered to embark for campaigns in distant sectors, sat in barracks growing restless, their war hymns giving way to mutters of unease. Governor Radek stood before the assembled high command, his voice booming with conviction as he promised the Emperor's light had not abandoned them. Yet even as he spoke, reports arrived that supply worlds had gone silent. Ammunition reserves dwindled. Food shipments ceased. The garrison meant to hold Marnov's gate for 100 years found itself counting the days until its stomachs ran dry. Conviction can hold an army together for a season. Hunger unravels it in weeks. On a distant agri-world, far from Terra's oversight, the silence brought a different fate. The great void freighters never came. Wheat, corn, and livestock grew in abundance, but with no ships to carry them away, warehouses overflowed. The local governor tried to impose rationing, storing food for the Imperium that would never collect it. When starving citizens came demanding bread, his enforcers fired into the crowd. The mob broke. Farms burned. Grain silos collapsed. In a matter of weeks, the planet went from abundance to famine, its own lifeblood squandered in riots and fire. To the Imperium's records, it was merely lost contact. To its people, it was damnation. In the void, fleets drifted half-seen in storms of unreality. One such fleet, the indomitable Spear, carried with it 50,000 soldiers of the Astra Militarum, bound for reinforcement at the Cadian Gate. The navigator, eyes seared from staring into the darkness of the warp, whispered apologies as his chats dissolved. The beacon was too dim, the path too twisted. The fleet became trapped in endless spirals, its clocks breaking under warp time's cruelty. On some ships, years passed. On others, only hours. When communications broke between them, captains resorted to superstition, sacrificing prisoners, chanting litanies, carving wards into their own flesh. The indomitable Spear never reached Cadia. Whether it was swallowed by the warp or spat out into some forgotten corner of the galaxy, none can say. For Cadia, its reinforcements were simply delayed. And always, among the people, rumors spread. In shrine cities, priests proclaimed louder that the Emperor still lived, their voices trembling as they demanded greater tithes, greater sacrifices, greater faith to strengthen his fading light. In the manufactorums, workers whispered that perhaps the Emperor was dead, that the golden corpse no longer fed the beacon. For such whispers, entire families were dragged to the pyres of the ecclesiarchy. Yet whispers do not die when blood is spilled, they spread. For the Adeptus Astats, too, the silence was awound. A single chapter could not defend an entire sector, yet when supply and reinforcement faltered, that was the burden laid upon them. On the frontier world of Kydros, the Azure Fangs fought an orc war. Alone, their distress calls lost in the void. Without reinforcements, they bled. Without the beacon, they could not retreat. When the war finally rolled across Kydros, no survivors escaped. To the Imperium, the Azure Fangs remain listed as inactive service, their chapter symbols still painted proudly on forgotten records. In truth, they are dust. For those who lived through these days, memory itself became a weapon. Some said the flickering was a test of faith, the Emperor's trial to separate the devoted from the weak. Others whispered it was punishment, a sign that mankind had failed its master. Still others claimed darker truths, that chaos gnawed at the beacon, that diamonds clawed at the throne itself. Whatever the truth, it mattered little to the countless billions caught in the silence. The Astronomican's dimming was not a story told in books, but hunger gnawing in their bellies, riots in their streets, and shadows lurking in the warp where light no longer reached. On Terra itself, within the shadowed halls of the Senatorum Imperialis, the High Lords convened in desperation. The Astronomican, their most sacred tool of control, had flickered too many times to dismiss as rumor. Vox reports from the Segmentum Solar were delayed, garbled, sometimes vanishing into static. Even the greatest astropaths, chained within the towers of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, wept as they confessed their visions had grown cloudy. Some saw the throne shining dimly, like a candle at the mercy of storm winds. Others claimed they could see nothing at all. Yet still, the High Lords argued. The Fabricator General declared that the fault lay in corrupted machinery within the Golden Throne, demanding the Adeptus Mechanicus be granted unchallenged access to repair what mortal hands could not touch. The Ecclesiarch thundered back that the beacon's dimming was a spiritual malaise, a weakening of faith, and demanded blood sacrifice and stricter heresy laws. The Lord Commander Militant of the Astra Militarum called for immediate redeployment of troops to reinforce Terra, warning that a galaxy blind in the warp would collapse inward upon the throne world like starving predators. Each voice fought for dominance, but none spoke of unity. The council fractured as the light dimmed. Beyond Terra's walls, the Inquisition whispered. For every lord who demanded faith or machinery, an inquisitor murmured that darker forces were at work. In sealed chambers, they debated whether the beacon's faltering was chaos sorcery, or perhaps the final decay of a god who had been a corpse too long. Radical inquisitors dared to suggest contingency plans, alternate beacons, even demonic pacts, to guide humanity through the warp. Puritans branded them heretics, ready to draw bolter and blade even against their own. Within the labyrinthine web of the Inquisition, allies turned upon allies, every suspicion sharpened into paranoia. Meanwhile, the Adeptus Mechanicus itself became a house divided. Some Magi declared that the throne was irreparably decaying, its machine spirits growing silent, their prayers unanswered. They prepared secret expeditions to ancient vaults, seeking forgotten technology that might replace the beacon. Others declared such quests blasphemy, proclaiming that only obedience to the Omnisea's design would restore the light. Forge World turned against Forge World, some mustering Skitarii legions for war, others cloaking themselves in silence. What had once been a single machine cult began to splinter into rival sects, each claiming they alone knew how to save mankind's beacon. The Imperial Navy, too, found itself paralyzed. Admirals received conflicting orders, one demanding they gather at Terra, another sending them to reinforce Segmentum Obscurus, yet another telling them to hold their current positions. Without the beacon, travel was madness, but without orders, entire fleets sat idle. On some ships, captains took it upon themselves to disobey, forging their own paths through the warp with reckless navigators. Few returned. Those who did bore haunted eyes, speaking of phantoms clawing at their hulls, of whispers echoing through decks, of time itself breaking apart in screams. The Admiralty silenced them, branding their stories as cowardice, but the crews remembered. On distant shrine worlds, the ecclesiarchy seized upon the faltering as proof of sin. Cardinals declared that the Imperium had grown decadent, that mankind's doubt was smothering the Emperor's flame. They ordered mass purges. Entire hab blocks were herded into pyres, their ashes offered as penance. For a time, the fires burned high enough to light the night skies. Yet still, the beacon dimmed. Faith enforced by fire gave no strength to the Astronomican's glow, but it gave priests the power of fear. And always, through every council, every purge, every whispered heresy, one truth remained. No one knew what was truly happening. The Astronomican's failing light was a mystery without answer, and in that absence, paranoia grew like rot. The Imperium had always been a colossus built on faith and fear, but with its guiding star faltering, the colossus began to crack. Those who ruled knew it. Those who whispered in shadows feared it. And those who prayed wondered if their God still heard them at all. The galaxy is vast, and though the Astronomican was humanity's torch in the dark, it was never the only fire burning. Beyond the Imperium's fragile lattice of faith and steel, enemies waited with endless patience. To them, the flickering of the beacon was no tragedy, it was opportunity. In the eye of Terra, sorcerers of the thousand suns gathered on demon-haunted spires, their rune-scribed eyes fixed on the pale glow of the Astronomican. For millennia, it had been the one constant barrier, a signal defying their master's dominion. Now, it sputtered like a candle drowning in wax. The sorcerers whispered incantations, summoning visions of mankind's confusion. Warp charts lost, fleets stranded, planets left defenseless. Each weakness was a blade, and chaos had never lacked the will to thrust. Warbands launched forth, their demonic escorts rising eagerly from the storms. Without the guiding light, imperial patrols stumbled blindly, and chaos fleets fell upon them like predators upon the blind. Ships burned, their crews torn screaming into the void. Where once the Astronomican had denied them easy prey, now the galaxy lay open, and the laughter of the gods echoed across the warp. Elsewhere, the Ox needed no subtlety. To them, the dimming light was not a matter of warp navigation or spiritual decay, but instinct. They smelled weakness. That had long drifted aimlessly now surged forward, driven by war bosses eager to carve apart worlds unable to summon reinforcements. On the frontier, an Orc horde descended upon the mining world of Dravik Prime. Its governors sent desperate pleas for aid, but no astropather's cry reached the void. Alone, Dravik's defenders fought until their ammunition ran dry, until bayonets dulled, until Orc boots thundered in the governor's palace. The Wa devoured the planet, and from its corpse, more Orcs rose, chanting for war, their numbers swelling. With each victory, The green tide grew, and with the beacon's falter, Imperial counterattacks came too late, or not at all. Far more silent was the awakening of the Necrons. For them, the Astronomican's faltering was no divine omen, but a signal that the galaxy's balance had shifted. On 1,000 tomb worlds, ancient protocols stirred. Stasis cradles hissed open. Metallic eyes lit with soulless fire. Where once Imperial fleets would have arrived within months to suppress awakening dynasties, now no one came. The Necron legions rose, unchallenged, carving through undefended systems with precision. Worlds vanished beneath their cold reclamation, their populations harvested or exterminated without mercy. To the Imperium, they became silent systems, catalogued as lost to warp storms, their fate unknown. To the Necrons, they were stepping stones toward dominion. Even the Tyranids, alien beyond all comprehension, felt the change. Though they did not see the Astronomican as men did, they sensed the disruption, the ebb of order. They followed the turbulence in the warp as sharks follow blood in the water. Splinter fleets altered their course, drawn to the flicker, probing where defenses grew weakest. Imperial commanders had long relied on the beacon to predict and intercept these horrors. Now, without it, worlds fell suddenly and without warning, consumed in silence, their screams unheard across the void. Every enemy had its reason, every predator its hunger. Chaos struck for vengeance and faith in their dark gods. Orcs surged for battle and plunder. Necrons rose for reclamation. Tyranids fed for survival. Yet all were united by one truth. The Imperium no longer stood untouchable beneath its radiant torch. With the Astronomican failing, the Emperor's dominion no longer shone across every star. Mankind had always believed itself eternal, protected by its master's light. Now, its enemies saw what mankind had never dared to admit. The Emperor's flame could die, and when it did, the galaxy would not mourn. It would feast. Across 1,000 sectors, the faltering of the Astronomican was not a tale told by priests or strategists, but a lived agony etched into the marrow of daily existence. For the common citizen of the Imperium, the change came subtly at first. Shipments grew late. Markets stood empty. Prices rose until bread became a luxury, until clean water was reserved for the privileged. On hive worlds, riots surged like tidal waves, millions of the dispossessed clawing at locked gates. The Arbites answered with shock mauls and suppressor fire, their black visors gleaming in the smoke. Yet even they could not contain a tide born of starvation. Whole levels of hives burned, their flames visible from orbit, until governors quietly scrubbed them from records as unfortunate but necessary purges. For the soldiers of the Astra Militarum, the faltering meant orders that no longer aligned with reality. Regiments were dispatched to reinforce sectors already fallen. Others were stranded in orbit around dying worlds, unable to depart without the beacon's light. The discipline of the Guard, forged in steel and blood, began to fracture. Some commanders maintained iron control, drilling their men with hymns and punishments. Others, abandoned by supply and communication, allowed their regiments to devolve into warbands, still bearing las guns, still bearing the Aquila, but answering to no master beyond survival. In time, those warbands would become indistinguishable from heretics, fighting under banners of desperation rather than faith. For the governors and lords of the Imperium, the dimming was a calculation of survival. Some turned inward, hoarding resources, fortifying their palaces, and declaring independence in veiled words. Others pledged louder fealty to Terra than ever, sending messages of unwavering loyalty even as they quietly broke tithe obligations. A few, driven by fear or ambition, turned to darker powers, whispering bargains into the void, desperate for a light to replace the one that failed. The Imperium had always demanded obedience above all, but with its hand weakened, obedience frayed. The bonds that held worlds together snapped, one by one, until whole sectors teetered on the edge of rebellion. And what of the enemies who watched? To Chaos, the Imperium's faltering was proof that the corpse god could bleed. To the Orcs, it was an endless promise of battle, green tides surging unopposed. To the Necrons, it was the first step in reclaiming what was once theirs, the galaxy's defenses falling into silence. To the Tyranids, it was sent upon the cosmic winds, drawing their hunger deeper into human space. For all their differences, the predators of the galaxy shared one truth: mankind was staggering, and a staggering beast draws teeth. Through all of this, whispers persisted in the dark corners of the Imperium. Some claimed the Emperor had spoken to them in dreams, that his silence was not death but metamorphosis, that he was withdrawing to prepare for a greater rebirth. Others swore he had abandoned mankind entirely, his throne empty, his light gone. For every prayer offered in hope, another was muttered in fear. Faith, once unshakable, now trembled. And as it trembled, so too did the pillars of the Imperium. The galaxy had not yet broken. Terra still burned with its endless fires, the Golden Throne still hummed with its ancient machinery, and the Astronomican still flickered, though dimly. Yet already, the Imperium's vast body was rotting from within, its arteries clogged with doubt, its sinews strained by enemies without number. The greatest empire mankind had ever known remained standing, but each day its shadow grew longer, darker, more fragile. And so the question whispered in every shrine, every barracks, every command chamber was the same. If the beacon truly died, if the Astronomican gutted out entirely, what would become of mankind? The answer was not yet clear, but the silence that followed the question was louder than any truth. In the Imperium of man, faith was never an ornament. It was the mortar binding a billion worlds together, the unspoken law carried in every prayer, every hymn, every oath whispered before battle. When the Astronomican shone brightest, it was proof of the Emperor's eternal presence, his golden fire lighting the galaxy itself. Priests declared that as long as the beacon burned, the Emperor watched, and mankind endured. But now, with its light faltering, those words grew hollow. On shrine worlds, the great cathedrals of the ecclesiarchy still thundered with sermons. Cardinals bellowed that the Astronomican's weakness was no failing of the Emperor, but of his children. Mankind, they said, had grown sinful, arrogant, indulgent. It was not the throne that waned, but the devotion of humanity. And so the orders went out, stricter penances, bloodier purges, greater tides of flesh and coin. Across the Imperium, millions knelt as whips cracked against their backs, offering their pain as a sacrifice to restore the dying light. For a time, the flames of faith seemed to blaze brighter. But beneath the smoke and fire, unease remained. For in the hidden corners of the hive cities, whispers carried like smoke through the vents. Men and women gathered in secret, their faces shadowed, their words hushed. Some spoke that the Emperor had truly died at last, that the Astronomican's flicker was his final breath. Others declared that he had never been divine at all, merely a tyrant bound to a throne, his power stolen from mankind's blood. These whispers became sects, sects became cults, and cults grew bold. Where once they hid in fear of the Arbites, now they gathered in open defiance, painting symbols of defiance on the walls of hab blocks. Some knelt before chaos, drawn by the promise of other gods who answered when the Emperor was silent. Others turned inward, worshipping strange visions of humanity's true destiny, divorced from the cops on Terra. The ecclesiarchy answered with fire, as it always had. Witch hunters scoured hives, torching entire blocks at the first scent of heresy. Pilgrims were dragged to pyres, their screams rising with the smoke. The priests thundered that the Emperor was testing them, that doubt was the greatest sin, that every hesitation was a knife in his holy body. But even as the flames rose higher, doubt spread. Fear can silence the tongue, but it cannot quiet the heart. Every lash of the whip, every public execution, every sermon that grew shriller and more desperate only revealed the truth. Faith itself was unraveling. On frontier worlds, where the Astronomican's light had always been faint, the collapse came faster. Entire congregations turned away from the ecclesiarchy, declaring that the Emperor's silence meant he had abandoned Terra. Some prayed instead to local saints, elevating mortal warriors and martyrs as new divinities. Others fused imperial doctrine with old planetary religions, reshaping shrines into hybrid temples. The Arbites tried to crush these movements, but their numbers were few, their reinforcements cut off by the warp. Slowly, frontier faith diverged. A man in the Segmentum Obscurus might call upon the Emperor as a god of wrath, while in Ultima Segmentum he became a figure of death and rebirth, his throne not a prison but a cocoon. Each cult insisted theirs was the truth. None agreed. And for the soldiers of the Imperium, the collapse was poison in the veins. Faith had always been their shield, their reason to march into fire with unflinching eyes. When commanders ordered them to hold a line, they did so because they believed the Emperor watched. But now, in the trenches of forsaken wars, soldiers whispered that perhaps no one watched at all. Some deserted, vanishing into the wastes. Others clung more tightly to faith, reciting litanies until their throats bled. Whole regiments fractured, one company embracing fanaticism, another sliding into despair. Discipline cracked not under the fire of the enemy, but under the silence of their god. The silent collapse was not a sudden fall. It was a creeping erosion, a slow gnawing at the soul of the Imperium. Faith did not vanish in a single day, nor did the Astronomican's light. But the two dimmed together, each reflecting the other, until even the most devout priests could not deny the truth. Something had changed. Something had broken. And once broken, faith is far harder to mend than flesh. The ecclesiarchy had faced doubt before. Heresies had risen and fallen. Cults had spread like weeds only to be scythed down by fire and blade. But the dimming of the Astronomican was different, for it was not rumor nor rebellion, but truth. The priests of the Imperium could not deny what astropaths and navigators reported in Terra. The beacon no longer burned as it once had. And so, in desperation, they sought to drown truth beneath spectacle. Across shrine worlds, the ecclesiarchy proclaimed miracles. In the Basilica of St. Eudoria, pilgrims wept as a statue of the emperor was said to shed tears of gold. In the catacombs of a distant hive, clerics declared that the bones of a martyred priest had begun to glow with holy light. On the ice fields of Duranos, an entire congregation claimed to see the emperor's silhouette blazing in the northern sky. Each miracle was trumpeted by the ecclesiarchy's choirs, carried on Vox networks to reassure the faithful. But whispers followed close behind. Some swore the golden tears were nothing more than melted auramite poured into cracks. Others said the bones were coated in promethium salts. And as for the northern lights, perhaps it was only the aurora, twisted by the warp's storms. For every miracle declared, another rumor of fraud followed, and those who believed less than absolutely were branded heretics. The priests answered doubt not with mercy but with fire. In Hive Ardentia, hundreds were dragged from their homes, accused of blasphemy for questioning a miracle. They were burned in pyres so vast that the smoke blackened the stars. In the Manufactoria of Boras 9, factory workers who refused to kneel during forced prayer were gunned down by the ecclesiarchy's enforcers. Yet for all the blood spilled, faith did not grow stronger. It curdled, festering beneath the surface, waiting for a voice that spoke not in fear, but in promise. And such voices rose. Rogue psychers, their minds seared with visions, wandered the wastes of frontier worlds, proclaiming themselves prophets. Some spoke that the emperor had abandoned his throne, that he now walked among his children once more, preparing to lead them into a new age. Others claimed he was truly dead, and that his death was freedom, that mankind must embrace its own destiny without chains. These psychers drew followers like moths to flame. They healed the sick with unnatural light, conjured fire from their hands, and spoke words that wormed into the minds of the desperate. To the ecclesiarchy, they were abominations. To the starving, the lost, the hopeless, they were saviors. Heretical prophets, too, found their time. One in particular, a man known only as Malchius the Pale, gathered thousands in the underhives of Corvus. His sermons echoed in the Dak, claiming the Astronomican's flicker was the herald of a coming dawn, that the emperor's fire was passing into mankind itself. He declared that every soul was divine, every man and woman a god in waiting, no longer bound to Terra's copse. The Arbites hunted him, the ecclesiarchy denounced him, but his followers defended him with suicidal devotion. When the Arbites stormed his cult's sanctum, they found only a burned sigil painted in blood on the walls, his body gone, his disciples vanished into the sprawl. Days later, new uprisings began across the sector, all claiming Malchius still walked among them. For the Inquisition, these movements were intolerable. Puritans called for the extermination of every prophet, every miracle, every sect not sanctioned by Terra. Radicals, however, whispered that perhaps some of these visions carried truth, that perhaps the Astronomican's fading was not decay, but transformation. Within the Inquisition's own halls, daggers turned inward as suspicion bled into paranoia. Was that psyche touched by chaos, or by the emperor himself? Was that miracle a fraud, or a genuine sign of his will? No one could agree, and so the purges grew bloodier. In truth, the silent collapse was not only the death of faith, but its mutation. Where once there had been one emperor, one throne, one light, there now rose 1,000 interpretations. The emperor as judge, as martyr, as reborn wanderer, as fallen tyrant. The emperor as silence, the emperor as dawn. The beacon's dimming had left a void, and humanity rushed to fill it, even if the shapes they gave it were twisted, broken, or false. Faith had always been the Imperium's iron mortar, binding its fractured parts into a single whole. With it, soldiers marched into certain death without hesitation, believing their sacrifice fed the emperor's eternal flame. Without it, the cracks became impossible to hide. Nowhere was this more evident than in the ranks of the Ustra Militarum. On the world of Nox Veris, the 82nd Valen Regiment was deployed against a Tyrannid splinter swarm. 4 days, the soldiers fought with valor, bolstered by sermons and promises of the emperor's light guiding their aim. But when the swarm's shadow fell across their minds and no chaplain's words could drown the gnawing dread, doubt became mutiny. In the trenches, men whispered that the Astronomican had gone dark, that the Emperor no longer watched. Their commissar executed 10 soldiers in a single day, yet fear spread like rot. The regiment broke ranks, abandoning their positions, fleeing into the wastes. The Tyranids devoured them all, but it was not Xeno's talons that killed them first, it was the collapse of faith. Elsewhere, entire guard companies began refusing orders. Some demanded proof that Terra itself had not fallen. Others proclaimed loyalty to their homeworlds above the Imperium, carving their own banners into armor once painted with aquilers. A handful declared themselves independent free hosts, fighting only for survival, no longer believing in the Emperor's protection. Commissars grew ever more brutal. Arbeit's patrols marched behind the guard to enforce obedience at gunpoint, yet discipline unraveled faster than it could be restored. An army that once fought for the Emperor now fought only for itself. The Adeptus Mechanicus faced a crisis of their own. For millennia, the cult Mechanicus had worshipped the machine god and venerated the Omnicia, the Emperor himself, as the living bridge between man and machine. But with the Astronomican dimming, dissent spread through the forges like sparks in dry tinder. Tech priests began to argue that perhaps the Emperor was not divine at all, but only the most potent psyker ever born, a battery burning out at last. Others, radical in their daring, proposed that the failing Astronomican was a sign that the true Omnicia was yet to come, and that they must look beyond Terra for salvation. On the forge world of Latis Prime, a sect known as the Calculus Theologica declared that the Astronomican's faltering was proof the Emperor was a flawed machine, and that a new perfect algorithm awaited discovery in the stars. Their creed spread through newspheric hymns, infecting cogitator networks with heretical logic viruses. The Fabricator General on Mars issued immediate orders for extermination. Skitarii legions stormed Latis Prime in a purge that lasted 17 solar weeks. When the smoke cleared, the forges were cold, the manufactoria silent, and the planet was reduced to slag. Yet fragments of the Calculus Theologica survived in encrypted data looms, smuggled out by Magi who still believed the creed. The heresy was not destroyed, only scattered. Even among the Emperor's angels of death, doubt took root. The Space Marines had been sculpted to embody loyalty, to be immune to fear and doubt. But they were still men, and even Gene Seed could not wholly silence the gnawing questions. In the chapter of the Argent Blades, a librarian recorded troubling visions, a galaxy without the Astronomican, where battle brothers fought one another, each claiming to serve the Emperor's true will. His warnings were sealed by the chapter master, but whispers spread. Were these visions prophecy, or corruption? The question alone was dangerous enough. Other chapters faced subtler fractures. Some began to interpret the Astronomicans dimming as a trial, the Emperor testing their purity, demanding unyielding devotion. Others saw it as betrayal. The Emperor had promised eternal guidance, yet his light waned. A handful quietly resolved to prepare for a future without Terra, storing gene seed vaults in hidden systems, carving secret paths through the void in case the Imperium collapsed. To speak such thoughts aloud was treason. To think them was survival. The Adeptus Arbites, too, faltered. As faith eroded, riots spread through hive cities, mobs demanding proof that the Emperor lived. When Arbites attempted to enforce order, they were torn apart by crowds chanting heretical hymns, or dragged into makeshift tribunals where citizens declared themselves free from Terra's chains. In response, the Arbites escalated to mass executions. Cities became charnel houses, their streets paved with corpses. Yet the more they killed, the less control they held. Law without belief was tyranny, and tyranny without fear was brittle as glass. The Inquisition watched this unraveling with grim inevitability. To some, it was proof that only fire could cleanse humanity, that the galaxy must be purged of all doubt, until only the most fanatical remained. To others, it was an opportunity. If the Emperor's light was fading, then perhaps the time had come to reshape the Imperium entirely, to forge a new order free from the corpse on the throne. In secret, conclaves split apart, radical factions gathering power, Puritan factions sharpening their blades. Where once the Inquisition had been humanity's shield, now it threatened to become the dagger in its own heart. Thus, as the silent collapse deepened, the Imperium's mightiest institutions, its armies, its machines, its enforcers, its angels, began to fracture. And with every fracture came a new danger, a new splinter of humanity that no longer believed in the same God, the same light, the same future. The Imperium still stood, but it no longer stood united. It was a fortress with walls cracking, and enemies circling closer with every passing hour. When faith fractures, something always rushes to fill the void. In the Imperium, where belief had been not merely a guiding principle but the very mortar of survival, the collapse was catastrophic. Across 1,000 worlds, prophets rose like carrion birds sensing blood, their voices threading through the cracks left by the Astronomican's dimming light. Some came cloaked in holy robes, others in rags, still others in the shifting flesh of demonic avatars. But all carried the same poisoned promise, that the Emperor's silence was proof not of his endurance, but of his death. On the shrine world of Kalenta, where cathedrals the size of continents had once resounded with endless hymnals, the first whispers were almost unnoticed. Pilgrims, desperate for comfort, began turning to a blind woman who claimed to see visions in the void. She spoke with quiet certainty that the Emperor had abandoned humanity, and that a new dawn was approaching, one not built on chains of obedience, but on the liberation of the soul. Within weeks, tens of thousands gathered to hear her words. Priests who tried to denounce her were drowned beneath crowds of zealots, their bodies burned in sacrificial pyres that once honored saints. By the time the ecclesiarchy acted, Kalenta was already lost, its vast basilicas echoing with chants to an unseen power that spoke through her lips. Elsewhere, the predators of the warp saw their chance. The diamonds of Tsinch whispered riddles into the dreams of astropaths, promising them clarity if only they abandoned their oaths to Terra. Those who listened awoke with their minds aflame, speaking in tongues, their eyes glowing with warp light. In the manufactoria of Dravenus Prime, entire crews of Laboris abandoned their stations to follow a new prophet, who declared the machine god false and the changer of ways the true architect of destiny. Their rebellion spread from manufactorum to manufactorum, until the forges that once armed the Astra Militarum churned out weapons only for heretics. When loyalist forces finally retook the planet, they found factories inscribed with runes of impossible geometry, their steel reeking of incense and blood. The most insidious prophets, however, were not always warp-spawned. Many were men and women who had once sworn loyalty to Terra, only to see that loyalty collapse beneath the weight of silence. A disgraced cardinal on the mining world of Phelan declared that the Emperor had never been divine, that his death was liberation. His sermons were crude, filled with bitterness and bile, but they spoke to a populace that had known nothing but hunger and taxation for centuries. If Terra cannot see us, he roared from the steps of a shattered shrine, then why should we bleed for Terra? The miners cheered, raising tools as weapons, and within days, the cardinal had become a warlord, commanding thousands who called themselves the freed men of Phelan. They no longer prayed, they fought, not for the Emperor, but for themselves. The Inquisition moved swiftly where they could, burning prophets, silencing heretics, deploying kill teams to sever cults before they bloomed. But for every prophet slain, 3 more rose from the ashes. The Imperium was too vast, too fractured, its communication lines frayed by the warp's storms. Rumors traveled faster than armies. A whispered tale of a world where the Emperor has fallen spread across subsectors like plague. Entire populations panicked at stories of miracles performed by false saints, of angels with wings of fire who offered salvation if only oaths to Terra were broken. And then came the miracles. In hive spires long choked by smog, fountains of blood erupted from statues of the Emperor. In the underhives, children spoke with voices too deep for their throats, proclaiming themselves messengers of gods yet unnamed. On frontier worlds, skies split with impossible lights, while dreams carried messages in syllables no mortal tongue should form. Were these the manipulations of chaos? Natural phenomena twisted by desperation? Or perhaps the final, desperate prayers of a dying emperor bleeding into the warp? No one could say for certain. But to the masses, they were proof that the old order was broken, and a new one was being born. In such an age, words were weapons as sharp as any chain's word. A single sermon could topple a governor. A single vision could turn a loyal regiment into a warband of heretics. And across the Imperium, these prophets multiplied, their voices competing, clashing, and corrupting. For every soldier who remained steadfast, another turned away. For every world that held to faith, another tore down its cathedrals and raised altars of bone. The Imperium had always faced threats from without. Now, it faced dissolution from within, driven not by blades, but by words. And as the galaxy leaned toward chaos, the greatest danger was not only that humanity would abandon the Emperor, but that it would find something else to worship instead. No force in the galaxy was more prepared to exploit faith's collapse than the ruinous powers. For 10,000 years, they had waited beyond the veil, their whispers seeding corruption in isolated hearts. But now, With the Astronomican's light dimming, the warp surged closer, and its voices were no longer whispers, they were storms. Each chaos god found prophets among mankind, shaping them into avatars of their design. Khorne's heralds rose first, for blood is always the easiest truth to preach. On the warworld of Godrose, a chaplain once sworn to the Black Templars broke beneath endless sieges. In his despair, he cast aside his oaths and proclaimed that only war itself was eternal. Clad still in the trappings of a loyalist, he began to preach that the Emperor's silence was a call to shed more blood, to offer skulls until his voice returned. Tens of thousands followed, believing that each sacrifice was a prayer. When the Inquisition finally arrived, they found an entire continent reduced to a wasteland of skull pyramids, the air so thick with iron and rot that even respirators choked. The chaplain was gone, vanished into the warp, his name taken up as a battle cry by marauding warbands. Tzeentch's influence spread more subtly, through dream and riddle. Entire planets awoke with strange prophecies etched into their walls, carved by hands that swore they never moved. A scribe on Vela Prime began predicting every Imperial raid with flawless precision, claiming visions gifted by the true architect of fate. When he was executed, 1,000 more rose, each declaring themselves inheritors of his sight. Administrators, commanders, even inquisitors began doubting the reliability of their own counsel. Could it be that these prophecies were genuine glimpses into futures hidden by the warp? Even skeptics could not deny that some of the false prophets' words came true. Slaanesh, ever the seducer, needed only to promise relief from fear and pain. In hive cities racked by famine, cults sprang up that worshipped the ecstasy of sensation, preaching that if the Emperor was gone, one should live for pleasure before the galaxy ended. At first their rituals were hidden, whispered in darkened hab blocks. But soon they spilled into the open, with processions of painted faces and jeweled blades, entire habs converted into temples of sound and color. Arbite squads who attempted to suppress these gatherings were torn apart by mobs not out of rage, but out of wild, intoxicated joy. In such chaos, who could argue the Emperor still ruled? Even Nurgle's prophets found eager ears. On plague-stricken colonies, where administratum aid never came, where Imperial medici had long since fled, the promise of grandfather's embrace felt more merciful than Terra's silence. Priests who once prayed for the Emperor's healing touch began to whisper new prayers in secret, and when the first bloated corpses rose from their graves with smiles still plastered on their rotting faces, entire villages welcomed them as miracles. Better to be loved in decay than abandoned in life. Yet chaos was not the only opportunist. The Xenos, too, saw advantage in this unraveling. The Ox needed no prophets, only the chance to charge at weakened prey, their war bosses crowing that Da Huma's god is dead. But others were more cunning. The Eldar, their seers forever watching the currents of fate, began sowing selective whispers among humans they could manipulate. In scattered frontier worlds, visions of radiant, elfin figures appeared in the dreams of imperial governors, urging them to break free of Terra's chains, to embrace a new alliance in the coming age. To a desperate leader surrounded by doubt, the voice of an Eldar farseer could sound like salvation itself. And then came the most insidious of all, the Genestilar cults. For generations they had lurked beneath the surface of countless worlds, their brood brothers hiding in manufactoria and mines. The failing Astronomican gave them their moment. No longer did they need to preach loyalty to Terra. Instead, they twisted the crisis into proof of their own faith. The Emperor is silent, their Magi declared, but the Star Children still call to us. Their light has never faltered. To starving miners and frightened laborers, this constancy was irresistible. While Terra remained distant and mute, the cult gave food, purpose, and the promise of deliverance. Entire planets fell without a single bolter fired, because their people chose to welcome the cult's truth over the Imperium's silence. Across the galaxy, the prophets of chaos and Xenos did not merely spread new faiths, they offered tangible hope, however twisted. A world under Nurgle's blessing might never starve again, even if its crops rotted. A hive given to Slaanesh might know ecstasy, even if it ended in madness. A colony bent to Genestilas might feel unity, even if it was only a prelude to consumption. Against such offers, what could Terra answer with silence alone? The Imperium had always known enemies without. Now it faced the greater threat, its people willingly opening their arms to those enemies, crowning them saviors in the Emperor's absence. When only a handful of worlds fell to heresy, the Imperium still believed the wound could be cauterized. But when sectors began to fracture, when entire star systems proclaimed new creeds in open defiance, the scope of the collapse revealed itself. No longer were these isolated cults. They were empires of belief rising within the copse of the Imperium, fighting not just for survival, but for dominion. The Calantine Rift became one such crucible. What began as a single blind prophetess on the Shrine world spread across a dozen systems in less than a decade. Pilgrim fleets that once carried millions to Terra diverted instead to her holy seat, guided by astropaths who swore they heard her voice more clearly than the Astronomican itself. Governors who resisted were overthrown by their own citizens. Those who submitted found themselves crowned as apostles, their banners refashioned with symbols of eyes weeping starlight. Loyalist forces attempted to intervene, but warp storms surged around the rift, cutting off reinforcements. Within, millions sang the same litany. The Emperor had passed into shadow, and they followed his successor. When the storms cleared, the sector was no longer imperial, it was a realm ruled by prophecy. The Phelan subsector spiraled into blood. There, the cardinal-turned-warlord declared the creation of the freed men, a rebellion built on the rejection of Terra's tithes. Miners, manufacturing workers, and guard deserters flocked to his cause, carving the aquila from their armor, replacing it with crude symbols of chains broken in fire. The Administratum declared exterminatus upon Phelan itself, but the rebellion had already spread. Entire neighboring worlds rejected imperial taxation, proclaiming themselves sovereign. They did not claim chaos. They did not name Xenos gods. They simply refused the Imperium. And in some ways, that defiance was more dangerous than outright heresy, for it spread to governors weary of sending tithe ships into an abyss while Terra's voice grew silent. On the eastern fringe, the chasm of stilled light saw perhaps the most grotesque union of prophets. There, cults of Slanesh and Genestila Magi converged, each promising their followers deliverance. At first they clashed, blades and claws tearing through hive spires in a frenzy of devotion. But as blood filled the streets, a pact was struck. The cults would unite their creeds, declaring both the Star Children and the ecstasy of the Void as manifestations of the same promised dawn. The result was an army like no other, a tide of mutated flesh and painted masks, singing hymns that merged alien worship with demonic exaltation. Loyalist guard regiments sent to cleanse the chasm were annihilated. Survivors spoke of enemies who would not break, who fought as if death was not defeat but consummation. Even the Void itself became contested. Pilgrimage fleets splintered, their crews divided between loyalty to Terra and new voices carried in dreams. On one such fleet, the Basilica of Endless Hymns, half the population rose in revolt mid-transit, claiming the stars themselves had crowned a new god. The ship tore itself apart in mutiny, its cathedral spires burning in void fire as tens of thousands were cast screaming into the warp. When fragments of the vessel finally drifted into Imperial patrol routes, they were found inscribed with symbols no Lex mechanic could decipher, as though the ship had been rewritten in its final moments by something watching. The Imperium's response grew increasingly desperate. The Inquisition declared entire sectors excommunicate traitores, ordering planetary bombardments on a scale unseen since the Horus heresy. But even this purge was hollow. For every world burned to ash, 3 more worlds whispered the names of their prophets louder. Fleets spread too thin, regiments bled dry, the High Lords themselves split over whether to enforce Terra or attempt reconciliation. Silence from Terra left every order suspect, every command vulnerable to doubt. And so wars of belief consumed whole stars. Brother fought brother, hive spires became battlefields, pilgrim fleets turned into warships for rival creeds. The galaxy had always been at war, but never like this. For now, the battlefield was not only fought with bolters and blades, it was fought with sermons, visions, and the power of words that reshaped reality itself. What made this chaos most dangerous was not its violence, but its allure. To the common imperial citizen, Terra had been a distant dream, its promises abstract. But these prophets stood among them, bleeding, preaching, offering miracles that could be touched. And as worlds fell, it seemed less like rebellion and more like revelation. The galaxy had entered a new age of gods, and humanity had chosen to listen. For the rulers who still called themselves loyal to Terra, the rise of false prophets was a trial no bolt shell could silence. Governors who once believed their authority rested on the Emperor's divine sanction found their thrones trembling beneath mobs who demanded new gods, new promises, new saviors. Some resisted with unyielding brutality. Others, facing impossible odds, began to wonder if survival meant compromise, if perhaps these prophets offered not only damnation but stability. On the fortress world of Hyrcania, the planetary governor, Vena Kardesh, stood before a crowd of 10,000 rioters chanting the name of a new prophetess who promised deliverance from endless tithes. His Arbites had already slaughtered hundreds, yet the chanting only grew louder. Kardesh had sworn his oaths upon the Aquila, had built his reign upon service to Terra. But as he watched the faces of his people, gaunt, starved, eyes alight with fanatic devotion to another, he faltered. When his advisors begged him to order orbital bombardments upon his own cities, he hesitated. That hesitation was enough. By dawn, his own bodyguard had turned upon him, crowning the prophetess as ruler. Hyrcania fell without a shot fired against the Imperium, not by strength of arms but by the weakness of belief. The Adeptus Astartes faced trials no less severe. The Salamanders, ever guardians of humanity, found themselves torn when refugees begged them not to slaughter those who had followed false prophets, but to show mercy, to recognize their desperation. One captain, his armor scorched from plasma fire, was said to have hesitated as a kneeling mother pressed her infant into his hands, begging for clemency. That hesitation nearly cost his squad their lives, for the crowd turned upon them in frenzy. The captain survived, but his brothers whispered afterward, hesitation was heresy, yet compassion was their creed. Where was the line when the galaxy itself blurred it? Other chapters met temptation with fire. The Kasharodans, arriving upon a world overtaken by Slanesh cults, made no effort to separate the guilty from the innocent. Their strike cruisers rained fire from orbit, and their warriors stalked the ruins in silence, executing every survivor. To them, there was no question, no hesitation, better to annihilate a world entire than allow doubt to fester. Yet in the void after their retreat, survivors' whispers spread, that it was not Terra that had saved them, but new prophets, for only their names had been spoken until the end. Even massacre could not kill belief. Some Astartes could not resist the pull entirely. Among the astral claws, already scarred by old rebellions, a company vanished during patrol. When found years later, they fought not under the Aquila but under a banner of burning suns, declaring themselves heralds of a god who had reclaimed the Emperor's flame. Their gene seed records were purged, their names stricken, but the stain could not be erased. If even the Emperor's angels could turn, then what hope had ordinary men? Within the halls of the Inquisition, debates grew venomous. Puritans demanded absolute fire, a cleansing of every world touched by prophecy, regardless of loss. Radicals argued that the Imperium must bend, that survival demanded absorbing these movements, disguising them beneath imperial banners. Some even whispered of using false prophets themselves as weapons, controlling them to channel the people's devotion until Terra's silence ended. The idea was heresy by any definition, yet desperation made heresy sound like strategy. The ecclesiarchy fared no better. Priests tasked with silencing prophets often found themselves outpreached, their hymns hollow beside the promises of miracles. Some broke under the weight of failure, joining the very cults they had been sent to destroy. Others, consumed by pride, declared themselves prophets in the Emperor's name, insisting that he still spoke through them alone. Entire schisms erupted, with ecclesiarchal forces battling one another in cathedral spires, their hymns drowned out by cannon fire. Thus, even those sworn to loyalty faltered. For some, the choice was surrender, for others, the abyss of fanatic violence. And in that abyss, the question haunted all, was loyalty still loyalty when the Emperor himself was silent? At first, the Imperium dismissed the prophets as localized outbreaks of madness, no more dangerous than the countless heresies it had crushed for millennia. But soon, the galaxy itself began to tremble under their growing weight. These were not small cults hidden in the shadows of high valleys. They were movements vast enough to unseat governors, to command fleets, to rewrite the faith of entire planets. The prophets had become more than rebels. They were architects of a new order. On the shrine world of Corvallis, pilgrimages once directed toward the Emperor's sacred relics now turned instead toward the eternal oracle, a blind youth who proclaimed visions of a future where mankind would be free of chains both human and divine. His sermons gathered millions in the great basilicas, where hymns once sung to the Emperor were replaced by chants of liberation. When the ecclesiarchy declared him heretic and demanded his death, the oracle's followers rose in a planetary revolt so sudden and coordinated that Arbite's precincts and guard barracks fell in hours. By the time imperial reinforcements arrived, they did not find a rebellion to crush, but an entirely new theocracy, fortified, armed, and ready to spread. Trade routes began to fracture. Rogue traders, ever pragmatic, turned their loyalties to whichever prophets could guarantee safe passage. In the far segmentum obscurus, entire convoys shifted allegiance, their holds carrying not the Emperor's banners but symbols of suns, wings, or bleeding crowns. To merchants and smugglers, it mattered not which god, or lie, was true. Stability was profit, and prophets promised stability where the Imperium had failed. The Astra Militarum, stretched thin, faced a nightmare. Regiments sworn to Terra found themselves fighting enemies who looked like the very civilians they had sworn to protect. But worse still were the mutinies. A battalion from Mordian, ordered to execute a city of prophet followers, refused outright. Their commander declared he would not slaughter the innocent for a throne that never spoke. Half his men joined him. The other half opened fire. By battle's end, the city was ash, the regiment destroyed, and the prophet's legend doubled in strength. The faithful had been willing to die rather than betray their creed, and even soldiers of the Imperium had hesitated. Whispers spread through the stars like wildfire. Worlds tired of endless tithes, of unending wars, of silence from Terra, began to see prophets as alternatives to a decaying empire. Some prophets promised liberation from war. Others promised immortality. Still others promised vengeance against those who had forsaken humanity. Each message was different, yet together they carried the same poison: doubt in the Imperium itself. Even the great institutions felt the rot. The Navigators' guilds, though bound by bloodlines older than the Imperium, debated whether new prophets might hold secrets of the warp that even their ancestors had never mastered. A navigator house secretly pledged itself to a prophetess said to walk the Imperium without need of the Emperor's light. If true, it would shatter the monopoly upon which imperial travel depended. If false, it still planted a seed of heresy among the most vital arteries of the Imperium. The prophets also began to fight one another. Though united by rebellion, their visions were not aligned. On the world of Farron's fall, two prophets, one proclaiming the mercy of new gods, the other declaring their vengeance, turned their followers against each other in wars bloodier than anything the Imperium could have devised. Entire continents burned under fratricidal zeal, until not even rubble remained. Yet even this chaos worked against Terra, for while prophets destroyed one another, the Imperium was shown to be powerless to intervene, irrelevant even in its own realm. In the void, warbands of renegades and heretics flew banners once thought buried with the Horus heresy. Some declared themselves heirs of Lorga, claiming that the age of true faith had finally come. Others styled themselves as new sons of the Emperor, twisting loyalty into a weapon of rebellion. When these fleets clashed with Imperial patrols, the brutality rivaled any Orc war or Tyrannid swarm, for these were not alien horrors but men who had turned belief itself into a weapon sharper than steel. And so the prophets became more than voices in the dark. They became movements, powers, empires in embryo. Some rose and fell in a single season, consumed by rivalries or purged by fire. Others endured, their names whispered across sectors, their teachings smuggled through the void like contraband scripture. For the first time since the age of apostasy, the Imperium faced not one heresy but 1,000, each growing, spreading, mutating like a disease. The threat was not a single rebellion to be crushed. It was a tide that no fortress, no decree, no sermon could fully contain. And above it all, the question remained: if prophets could promise salvation while Terra remained silent, how long before entire sectors ceased to believe in the Emperor's throne altogether? Thus, the galaxy tilted, not by the blade of Xenos or the fangs of diamonds, but by words, by faith, by visions. The prophets had risen, and with them, the Imperium trembled upon the edge of collapse. There is a sound that haunts the void, not the roar of plasma fire, nor the screech of tearing hulls, but silence, the silence of Terra. Across the galaxy, that silence became unbearable. Vox relays still carried orders in the Emperor's name, edicts still issued from the Adeptus Terra, yet the voice of the Master of Mankind remained mute. The Astronomican flickered, erratic as a candle guttering in a storm, its once bright beacon dimming and flaring without pattern. For navigators, this was more than a nuisance. It was terror itself. Whole convoys became stranded between the stars, their journeys stretching from weeks into years. Some ships never arrived at all, their hulls lost to the hungry tides of the warp. To sailors and soldiers alike, it seemed as though the Emperor had turned his gaze away. It began slowly, with whispers in barracks, manufactoria, and noble courts alike. Some said Terra had fallen. Others claimed the Emperor was already dead and the High Lords lied to maintain their power. Still others believed the prophets had slain him in spirit, their faith devouring his strength until even the Golden Throne was empty. None of these tales could be proven, yet each gained weight because the silence gave no denial. Humanity was a species built on rumor and fear, and in those days, rumor became a weapon sharper than any chain's word. The Imperium had always been fractured in truth, held together less by unity than by the shared terror of falling apart. But now those cracks widened. Entire subsectors began to act as if Terra no longer existed. Governors withheld tithes, arguing they must feed their own worlds first. Some declared themselves protectorates of the Emperor's dream, ruling in his name but ignoring any command from the High Lords. Others abandoned the Aquila altogether, swearing loyalty to local prophets or to themselves, their banners declaring a new age where no throne would dictate their fate. Civil wars erupted in system after system. On the hive world of Dorithus, the planetary governor refused to send men to aid the Segmentum fleet, claiming his duty was only to his people. The fleet, already desperate, blockaded the world, but the governor unleashed his Skitarii allies against them. What followed was not the usual rebellion of starved underhivers but a full mechanized war between imperial forces themselves, fought with precision, ruthlessness, and the cold efficiency of those who still claimed loyalty to the Emperor, even as they slaughtered his servants. The Adeptus Astats, once the shining hammer of the Emperor's will, did not stand as one. Some chapters, particularly those close to Terra, remained resolute, answering the summons of the High Lords even when their fleets dwindled and their brothers never returned. Others, however, wavered. When the Astronomican failed them, when their astropaths screamed of silence and void, when the Imperium offered no answer but sacrifice, a few chose to carve their own paths. Not all turned heretic. Some declared themselves guardians of humanity alone, protectors of sectors that Terra had abandoned. To those under their protection, such warriors seemed more present, more divine, than a distant emperor whose light no longer shone. To the Imperium, though, this was nothing less than apostasy. The ecclesiarchy fought to stem the tide with fire and faith. Cardinal worlds blazed with sermons, their preachers bellowing that doubt was heresy, that silence was merely a test of devotion. Flagellants marched in the streets, whipping themselves bloody to prove their loyalty. Relics were paraded through cities, bones and icons held high as proof the Emperor endured. For a time, these displays worked. Pilgrims came in droves, seeking to drown their doubt in pageantry. But the longer the silence stretched, the more those flames burned out. Even the most fervent preachers could not answer why the Emperor no longer spoke. In this atmosphere of fracture, the Inquisition became both more feared and more despised than ever. Witch hunts scoured entire sectors, rooting out prophets and slaughtering their followers in purges so vast that billions died in firestorms. To the Inquisitors, this was the only way to preserve the Imperium. To those who survived, it was proof that the Imperium had become a beast devouring its own. Each purge, though intended as a lesson, instead planted the seeds of rebellion, convincing more worlds that Terra was not salvation but doom. Even among the Adeptus Mechanicus, doubt spread. They had long revered the Emperor as the Omnicia, yet as silence fell, debates raged across the Forge worlds. Some argued the Omnicia had departed, leaving the Mechanicus to chart its own destiny. Others whispered that the prophets, in their strange visions, had revealed new blueprints, new mysteries of machine and spirit that surpassed the decrees of Mars. Forge after forge split between loyalty and heresy, their war engines sometimes marching against one another even as alien threats pressed on every frontier. The galaxy was unraveling, not through sudden catastrophe but through 1,000 fractures all at once. And yet, through it all, hope remained a dangerous ember. To some, hope lay in Terra's eventual voice, a belief that silence would end and the Emperor would thunder forth again. To others, hope lay in prophets, in new gods, in visions of futures unchained. And to some, the most radical of all, hope lay in freedom, from the Imperium, from the throne, from the endless cycle of war and obedience. The Imperium was fracturing, yes, but each shard burned with its own fire, bright and volatile. And in that fire, a new galaxy was beginning to take shape. The unraveling of the Imperium did not descend into chaos all at once. It came like cracks in ice, spreading quietly, branching into patterns too intricate to see until the surface shattered beneath one's feet. At first, the High Lords tried to project the illusion of order. Decrees were issued, fleets dispatched, inquisitorial kill teams unleashed into worlds where prophets had taken hold. But each act of control only revealed how little control remained. For every rebellion suppressed, 2 more rose. For every fleet that departed, fewer returned. It was not a war of worlds, it was a war of faith, and faith is the most volatile weapon in the galaxy. In Segmentum Pacificus, the Helican sector declared secession outright. Its planetary governors, bound together in an emergency council, declared that without the Emperor's voice, the Imperium was a husk, a lie perpetuated by bureaucrats too weak to admit the truth. They swore their worlds would remain human, remain pure, but not remain slaves to Terra. With its own fleets, its own guard regiments, and its own manufactoria, the Helican League, as they now named themselves, became the first true secessionist state since the days of the Horus Heresy. They even sent emissaries into the void, calling upon other governors to join them. Some answered. The High Lords declared extermination. They issued orders for fleets to converge upon Helican and bring the sector to heel. But the Astronomican's failing light meant those fleets arrived scattered, delayed, piecemeal. And when they arrived, they found not a few rebels, but an entire war machine prepared to meet them. What followed was a grinding, bloody conflict that drained resources the Imperium could not spare. And though the Imperium claimed victory in some campaigns, the mere existence of Helican's defiance lit sparks in 100 other sectors. Among the Adeptus Astats, the fractures were even more devastating. The galaxy remembered the heresy with Terra, a wound that had never fully healed. But now brothers turned against brothers again, not in loyalty to Warmaster or Chaos, but in loyalty to their own visions of duty. Some chapters declared themselves wardens of the Emperor's silence, choosing to defend their assigned regions without heed for Terra's summons. Others remained staunchly loyal, branding such independence as treachery. And when loyalist chapters sought to bring the wardens to heel, Astats met Astats in battle. On the world of Telvaris, the Iron Talons clashed with the Dawn Blades. Both had once fought side by side against Orc war bands. Both still proclaimed loyalty to the Emperor. But one obeyed Terra, the other obeyed its own oaths to the people of its sector. In the skies above Telvaris, their fleets tore one another apart, boarding actions turning into duels of bolter and blade. When the dust cleared, the surface of the planet was scorched, its cities reduced to rubble, not by Xenos or diamonds, but by the sons of the Emperor themselves. To those who survived on the ground, the distinction between loyalist and traitor no longer mattered. To them, the Emperor's angels had become indistinguishable from executioners. These wars birthed something new, the first whispers of successor empires. Some prophets styled themselves as rulers, not merely visionaries. Some governors crowned themselves emperors of their own right, no longer pretending to bow to Terra. And in certain places, those dreams took root. The Valen Expanse declared itself a protectorate of humanity, swearing allegiance not to gods, but to man's survival. Its leaders claimed that only by abandoning superstition and seizing their own fate could humanity endure the horrors of the void. Though scorned by both Ecclesiarchy and Mechanicus, their ideals spread like wildfire among worlds weary of endless faith without reward. The Adeptus Mechanicus, too, began to splinter further. Forge worlds aligned with rival powers, not only to prophets but even to rogue governors and warlords. The promise of access to resources, or the freedom to pursue forbidden technologies, tempted many magi. Entire Titan legions vanished into secessionist banners. Where once the Imperium had marched Titans as symbols of unity, now they became banners of division, iron gods striding in defense of breakaway empires. Yet not all fractures bred despair. Among many mortals, there was a strange sense of liberation. Freed from the crushing bureaucracy of Terra, freed from tides that drained their worlds to dust, some planets flourished. Agricultural worlds once bled dry now fed themselves. Hive cities built civic militias instead of feeding men into distant wars. These pockets of renewal were small, fragile, and often crushed when imperial fleets finally arrived. But the memory of them lingered. For the first time in millennia, some humans wondered if they might live without the Imperium at all. But hope is never left unchallenged in the galaxy of the 41st millennium. What freedom one world discovered, another paid for in fire. Breakaway empires drew the attention of raiders, pirates, and worse. Ox swarmed against worlds no longer shielded by imperial fleets. Tyrannid tendrils sought unguarded stars. And always, Chaos whispered. For every prophet who promised light, there was another who promised damnation. And where imperial unity fractured, the eye of Terra watched, and hungered. Still, the question burned across every sector, spoken aloud in some places, whispered in terror in others. If the Emperor truly was dead, what came next? Was this collapse the end of mankind, or the birth of something beyond the Imperium? The galaxy wastes no time when weakness is shown. As the Imperium fractured, as prophets rose and governors seceded, the old enemies of mankind watched and pounced. Ox, drawn by the scent of war, descended upon border worlds with laughter booming across the stars. Their once kept in check by coordinated imperial response, now found scattered defenders too divided to stand. Where one world might once have cried for aid and received regiments, now its pleas echoed unanswered. Green tides swept across the Segmentum Tempestus, tearing through manufactoria and bastions alike. Each fallen fortress became not only a loss of ground but a victory chant for orc war bosses, who claimed the galaxy was finally theirs to take. Tyranids, too, pressed their advantage. The splinter fleets, once resisted by concentrated imperial force, now struck undefended sectors. They moved like a tide of hunger, devouring worlds abandoned to civil war. In Helicon's contested reaches, a cluster of agricultural planets fell in silence. Communications ceased, only scraps of astropathic screams reaching the void. When scouts finally arrived, they found nothing but barren husks, stripped of all life, as though no human had ever walked there. The Imperium had feared Tyranids as the doom of all, but now they were not faced as a united foe. Each world stood alone, and alone, no world survived. And beyond these horrors, the Necrons stirred. Long had they been patient, awakening tomb by tomb, world by world, as the galaxy's noise kept eyes elsewhere. Now, in the absence of coordinated imperial vigilance, more dynasties rose. On the fringe of Ultima Segmentum, entire sectors awoke to the cold march of living metal. Cities that had survived millennia of war crumbled in hours under Gauss fire. The prophets, who had claimed new gods watched over humanity, fell silent when their visions offered no protection from ancient, soulless legions. To mortals caught in that awakening, there was no difference between the silence of Terra and the silence of the stars. Both abandoned them. Yet more dangerous still than Xenos was the creeping tide of chaos. The prophets who had preached liberation were joined now by darker voices. Not all were false, and not all were human. Diamonds whispered through the veil, seeding visions in the minds of desperate psychers. Entire cults arose within breakaway empires, promising not freedom but power, real, tangible power. Where imperial discipline had once curbed such heresies with fire, the fractured galaxy offered fertile ground. Some prophets were revealed to be puppets of the dark gods, their miracles nothing more than warped trickery. Others willingly pledged themselves, believing that in the Emperor's absence, the ruinous powers were the only divine truth remaining. The result was horror beyond reckoning. Worlds fell not to guns or fleets, but to faith turned inward, to diamonds called forth in rituals of blood. Hive spires collapsed under the weight of madness, their citizens chanting praises to unseen masters as reality itself warped. Even breakaway empires that had sought freedom from superstition found themselves overrun, their armies helpless before demonic incursions that the Inquisition might once have recognized and purged. And in the midst of this, the Imperium's fragments faced impossible choices. Should they cling to the crumbling authority of Terra, rallying what faith remained even as silence deepened? Or should they gamble on independence, risking annihilation from Xenos or corruption from chaos? Some chose one path, some the other. Neither path offered safety. The Astra Militarum, always the bedrock of imperial defense, splintered most tragically of all. Regiments once bound by honor to fight shoulder to shoulder now found themselves on opposite sides of civil wars. Some turned mercenary, selling their guns to prophets, warlords, or governors. Others clung desperately to loyalty, defending worlds in the Emperor's name even when their supply lines vanished, even when reinforcements never came. In some systems, the war banners of loyalist guardsmen stood beside the standards of secessionists, fighting orcs or Tyranids together, only to turn their weapons upon one another once the alien threat was beaten back. Unity lasted as long as survival required, and no longer. And still, the Astronomican faltered. The flame that had been humanity's guide for 10,000 years grew weaker, dimmer, flickering in ways navigators described as agonized. To those who clung to faith, the flicker was proof the Emperor still lived, still fought unseen battles in the warp. To others, it was evidence of his corpse finally rotting, his light sputtering out. The truth remained unknowable, but its effect was the same. Fleets scattered, trade collapsed, isolation deepened. The galaxy had always been a place of war. But now, war was no longer at the fringes. It was within. It was between. Humanity was not merely embattled by Xenos and chaos, it was embattled by itself, unable to decide if it still had an emperor to follow, or if his absence meant the time of man had come to an end. And yet, in the whispers of those who still prayed, in the dreams of those who still believed, there lingered a terrible question. If the Emperor was truly dead, then whose voice would rise to claim the silence? The Imperium had once called itself eternal. Worlds rose and fell, governors betrayed their posts, but terror endured. Now, however, the truth was laid bare. Eternity was a myth, and humanity's empire was not a monolith but a patchwork of fragile allegiances. With the Emperor's silence, that patchwork unraveled, each thread fraying into banners of its own. The galaxy no longer spoke with one voice. It murmured with 1,000 tongues, each declaring a future that claimed to be destiny. In the east, the Helican League solidified its power. No longer merely secessionists, they forged treaties, built fleets, and crowned a high protector who claimed stewardship of humanity itself. They preserved the trappings of the Aquila but bent its wings into a new sigil, declaring the Emperor not as a god but as the first among men, a hero whose death demanded not worship, but inheritance. For those weary of endless devotion, the League offered a vision of humanity unchained, pragmatic and determined to endure without divine aid. And to many who had lost families to the ecclesiarchy's fires, it seemed the truest hope. Far to the south, a rival vision rose. The prophets who proclaimed themselves voices of new gods gathered into what became known as the Covenant of Flame. They were not united by doctrine but by the conviction that the void demanded faith, and where one god had fallen silent, countless others could rise. Their banners bore suns, blooded wings, and burning crowns, symbols of visions too varied to reconcile, yet they marched together against Terra. To the Covenant's faithful, the death of the Emperor was not an end but a revelation. Humanity had always been destined to find gods beyond him. Between these extremes, the Imperium still clung to itself. Terra burned brighter with ritual than ever before, though its light grew hollow. The High Lords commanded obedience, declaring the Astronomicans faltered to be a test of faith, not a sign of decay. Fleets still flew the Aquila, guard regiments still fought and died in his name, but even among the loyal, questions festered. Was obedience to silence still obedience to him? Or was it submission to the High Lords alone? To question was heresy, but heresy had already become the air humanity breathed. The Astartes, fractured and divided, now became the symbols of this galactic schism. Some chapters aligned with the League, their primarchos reinterpreted as service to humanity, not to Terra. Others lent their bolters to the Covenant, declaring the Emperor's silence as proof that mankind's faith must expand to encompass the cosmos. Still others remained true to Terra, slaughtering their brothers with grim resignation. Across the stars, angels of death became avatars of division, each legion carrying not just war but ideology. When they clashed, it was not merely for territory, but for the very meaning of humanity's future. And yet, it was not only institutions that fractured. Cultures themselves began to shift. On hive worlds where prophets had once whispered rebellion, entire generations grew up never knowing Terra's commands. To them, the idea of an all-seeing emperor was a fable, no more real than the myths of Xenos. In frontier colonies, independence became a creed, and those who survived without aid began to see themselves not as Imperials, but as heirs to a new humanity, one that would not kneel to any throne. Even language itself began to splinter. Prayers once uttered in the High Gothic of Terra were replaced with local hymns, local names, local gods. The Mechanicus, always divided between Mars and Terra, now saw the chance to become sovereign. Some Forge worlds declared the Omnicia had indeed departed, leaving the cult Mechanicus as rightful heirs to his works. They built their own empires of steel, trading weapons and void ships to whichever faction offered resources in return. Titans once sworn to the defense of the Imperium now marched under banners alien to Imperial eyes, striding across battlefields where brothers killed brothers. For ordinary mortals, life became paradoxical. In some places, freedom bloomed, prosperity unshackled from tithes. In others, despair deepened, as cults, Xenos, and diamonds exploited their isolation. The fate of one world was no longer bound to the fate of another. Humanity was splintered, not merely politically, but spiritually, each planet a shard of a broken mirror, reflecting different visions of what it meant to endure. And through it all, the silence endured. The Astronomican flickered, sometimes flaring as though to remind all of his existence, sometimes dimming until navigators wept, believing it gone forever. That flicker was the cruelest torment of all, for it offered no certainty. Was the Emperor alive, dying, or dead? Was his silence judgment, exhaustion, or finality? No one could say, and so every answer became truth for those desperate enough to believe it. Thus the galaxy entered a new age, not of unity, not even of survival, but of fracture. Each empire, each creed, each prophet, each warlord declared themselves the inheritor of humanity's destiny. Whether mankind would endure as one, as many, or not at all, was no longer Terra's decision to make. It was written now in the wars of its scattered children. The galaxy burned, not in one great pyre, but in 1,000 scattered fires. None were bright enough to illuminate the whole, yet each cast shadows deep enough to consume its own corner of the stars. Humanity, once bound by the Emperor's unseen hand, was now a people divided, empire without emperor, faith without certainty, heirs without inheritance. And yet, in the darkness, the question no one dared voice aloud remained: was the emperor truly gone? The High Lords swore he endured. Their proclamations thundered across void relays, bolstered by endless processions of priests who wept before hollow altars. To admit otherwise would have been to unravel what remained of Terra's dominion. Yet the flicker of the Astronomican betrayed their certainty. Some days it flared so bright that navigators fell to their knees, blinded by its intensity. Other days, it withered, pulsing like a dying star. For some, this was proof of his struggle; for others, evidence of his death. For the rest, it was simply terror, terror of the unknown, terror of a universe without its eternal beacon. Across the stars, rumors multiplied. Some claimed the emperor had chosen silence to test his children. Others whispered he had ascended beyond godhood, no longer bound to the material realm. In the underhives, prophets declared he had abandoned humanity altogether, leaving it to reap the fruits of its pride. And in darker places, heretics dared to suggest the unthinkable, that his silence was not his own, but the laughter of the dark gods muffled through the cracks of the golden throne. Each faction painted his absence in its own colors. The Helican League held him as the greatest mortal of history, a father whose death demanded maturity, not prayer. The Covenant of Flame worshipped his silence as a doorway to a pantheon yet unborn. The ecclesiarchy filled cathedrals with ever louder hymns, as though sheer volume could summon him back. Even the Mechanicus forged new theories, that the emperor had dispersed into the Nusfu, a machine ghost guiding mankind through circuits and code. None agreed, yet none abandoned him fully. For even in absence, his presence lingered, a void around which all else orbited. War became not just inevitable, but perpetual. Brother killed brother, not only for territory, but for meaning itself. Astarte's legions slaughtered each other over what the emperor's silence meant, their bolters enforcing theology as much as strategy. Guard regiments burned worlds in the name of interpretations no two commanders fully shared. And as battlefields soaked with blood, the warp thickened, its tides feeding on doubt as readily as fear. Diamonds whispered with greater clarity than ever before, offering answers where the emperor offered none. Yet not all succumbed to despair. On certain worlds, strange resilience bloomed. Colonies cut off from terror adapted, thriving without tithe or decree. Freed of dogma, some rediscovered ancient technologies, or struck pacts with Xenos once thought untouchable. Others forged new cultures, new identities, no longer imperial but human still. To some, these sparks of survival were heresy. To others, they were the first signs of humanity's rebirth, a species no longer shackled to a throne of gold, but tempered by fire, learning once more to stand on its own. And so the Imperium was no longer singular. It was legion, fragmented into rival heirs, each claiming to embody the emperor's will, or his memory, or his rejection. No voice was loud enough to silence the others. No blade sharp enough to cut through the galaxy's chaos. The throne on Terra remained the hollow center of it all, a monument both sacred and meaningless, radiant and void. But there were moments, rare, fleeting, when something stirred. In the deep places of the warp, navigators reported hearing whispers threaded within the storms, voices that were not the screams of diamonds. In their dreams, some saw a figure of light, faceless yet unyielding, watching silently as mankind tore itself apart. Was it him, weakened but not gone? Or was it simply the echo of humanity's desperate need, a phantom born from longing? No one knew. Perhaps no one ever would. Thus the age of fracture began. An Imperium once bound by faith was now defined by doubt. A species that had once looked to a single throne now gazed into the abyss, each world inventing its own truth, its own hope, its own doom. The galaxy was louder than ever before, filled with hymns, screams, wars, and declarations, but beneath it all, the silence endured. For if the Emperor truly lived, he spoke no word. And if he truly died, his absence was more terrible than any god's wrath. The galaxy marched on, not knowing whether it carried his legacy.